state justified. Thank you.
Edwin Black talks about an agreement made between Hitler's government and a group of Zionist leaders in 1933. The agreement called for the transfer of 55,000 Jews and $100 million to Palestine in exchange for calling off a planned economic boycott of Nazi Germany by Jewish organizations. Barnes & Noble Booksellers in Rockville, Maryland, hosts the hour-long event.
So we're here with Edwin Black, and most people know you for some of the bestsellers, some of the books that Mitchell has just referred to. IBM, The Holocaust, War Against the Weak, Internal Combustion, Banking on Baghdad. All of these books, bestsellers, were written, however, in the 21st century. You have, I understand, somewhere around 69 different editions, published in about 14 languages in 61 countries. The question that we're focusing on today was actually your first book, called The Transfer Agreement, the dramatic story of the Pact between the Third Reich and Jewish Palestine. This book was published in 1984, so it's been 25 years ago. And at the time that it came out, I remember there was a tremendous amount of media attention, and also it was a very controversial book. It was one that there was a tremendous amount of discussion about it, and so that's really what brings us here today. Let's go first to that issue. What was it about the publication of this book and the thesis that you were putting forth? What was it that garnered so much attention and so much controversy?
The story of the transfer agreement is the story of the pact between the Zionists and the Nazis that was launched in the first weeks of the Third Reich in 1933. It began in the spring of 1933 and was consummated in August of 1933. Most people don't know that when Hitler came to power, the Jews actually fought back, and they fought back hard, and they fought back immediately. Hitler came to power on January 30th, 1933. The first concentration camp was actually opened up a series of them between March 8th and March 10th of 1933. The anti-Jewish laws followed shortly thereafter. And by March 27th of 1933, the Jewish war veterans had actually started a series of international protests and marches. And on March 27th of 1933, 1 million protesters jammed Madison Square Garden, and there were boycott and protest movements all over the globe, led by the Jews, but certainly involving the interfaith community, the labor unions, anyone who wanted to profit at Germany's expense and to protest the Nazi regime.
So we're talking, this is about 10, 12 years before the onset of World War II.
World War II began at 6 a.m. on September 30th, 1939.
So, right.
So we're talking, Hitler came to power in 33, the Nuremberg Laws in 35, Kristallnacht in 1938, the war in 1939, and most of the genocidal period, the so-called final solution, I guess, would have begun in the summer of 1941, the fall of 1941, and then commencing at full speed in 1943, 4, and 5. So what the Zionists did was they realized that protest was fruitless.
Let's take a moment. Let's be sure we define Zionists. Those are the people who, what were they doing?
The Zionists? I believe that most people don't know what the word Zionism means.
Let's start with that.
Well, at the end of the 19th century, there were a number of nationalistic movements across Europe. There was the concept of Armenian nationalism, there was East European nationalism, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. There was a wide group of people who were seeking to self-govern. One of these many groups was the Jewish people, and Zionism is nothing more than Jewish nationalism.
So we're talking the Jewish nationalists.
The Jewish nationalists, okay. The Zionists, seeking to legally organize themselves into a state under international law, which was done through the League of Nations.
Okay.
Sought to move the Jews who were persecuted, especially in Europe, into Jewish Palestine. Most people today think of Palestinians as Arabs, but the entire world in 1933 thought the word Palestinian meant Jewish nationalist,
Jews, right.
Zionist. The Jewish Agency for Palestine, the Palestine Post, Jewish Palestine. That's why the subtitle of the book is Jewish Palestine, because that was the body of the Jews in what became the State of Israel. It was called Jewish Palestine, and the term for the Jews, internationally recognized in ordinary parlance and officially, was Palestinian.
Palestinians.
So they used to refer to Jews as Palestinians.
So these Zionists, who were the advocates then for a Jewish homeland, pick up our story in terms of the controversy.
They saw the end before anyone saw the end. And they said the only thing that we can do to save a remnant, because they saw it coming, they knew the history of the Jews, the recent history and the distant history. They saw it coming, and they made a deal with the Reich to transfer out the Jews of Nazi Germany and other parts of Europe into Palestine. Now, how are you going to do that? That's going to be impossible, because who's running Palestine? Palestine is being run by the British. It is being run under the so-called mandate system, which means the League of Nations mandated Palestine, which was Turkish territory before that, to be a Jewish homeland. But there were rules in place. And the rules, and this is important, the rules were that Jews could not enter Palestine without $5,000 in cash or 1,000 British pounds. And this was called the so-called capitalist immigration certificate. Now, how does a Jew leave Nazi Germany, where there are currency restrictions, where no one can bring a Reichmark out of Germany? How does that Jew get into Palestine as a so-called official refugee? The answer is the Germans concocted the idea, and the Zionists concocted it with them, that German goods would be sold. And as German goods were sold, money would be produced. A Jew in Germany, in this complex arrangement, would take his personal household possessions and assets and put them in a special bank. And that bank was called Pal Troy. Then a second bank was set up called the Anglo-Palestine Bank, and that bank was in Palestine. The money would be put into the German bank. The Nazi goods would be sold by the Zionist organization across the Middle East, and especially in Palestine. When the goods were sold, they generated revenue, which went into the Anglo-Palestine Bank. The Anglo-Palestine Bank then provided the money for the Jews to bypass the currency restriction that the British had imposed, and they would come in. In the process, the Nazis could restore their economy. The Nazis could break the boycott, because you could not transfer a Jew by selling the goods and at the same time boycott the goods. The infrastructure of Jewish Palestine was built up. Pipes, steel, breweries, homes, cars, buses, all of these things German made. And I wondered when I first went to Israel, why are there so many Mercedes-Benz running
Everybody
around?
asked that question.
We all
Sure.
asked that question.
Right.
And that's where I really start.
Well, is that what's got you interested in in this topic?
No, what actually got me interested in is that we'll actually get to that in a little bit. It was the
All right, we'll come back to
Martians
that.
in
Let's
Skokie.
stay with what you're talking about. Go ahead.
So I wrote this book and explained how it happened. And in the process, 25 years ago, I was the first one to talk about the economic consequences of the Holocaust. At that time, people said, why are you talking assets? They were still trying to comprehend the enormity, the scope of the bloodshed. How many people died? How many people were gassed? How many trains were there? People were not talking about money. Now today, that dominates the conversation as assets. I want my property back. I want my insurance back. I want all these things back.
Sure.
But in those days, it was all almost blasphemous. It was a few decades ahead of its time to discuss the money consequences. But I realized that the scope of the bloodshed was in many ways linked to the economic impact of the Holocaust. In addition, I was the first one to use the word Nazi and Zionist in the same sentence. Now it is today everywhere, especially by the enemies of the Jewish state. But the fact is, at that time, it was completely unexpected. And so that's why the book was extremely controversial. That's why the media jumped on it. I went on a giant tour, and even though I did my best to convey the information as best as I could, it was quite shocking. And so we have people hiring psychologists to go on television and analyze me.
Did people assume you were saying there was a sense of cooperation between the Nazis and the Zionists, and that was part of what then was so disturbing?
Well, they were trying to say that I was blaming the Jews.
Right. For their very own fate, instead of seeing this whole elaborate scheme and in terms of
terms of a rescue.
Got it.
In fact, I had a problem with my own parents, who were survivors from the train to Treblinka and forest fires, who thought that I was perhaps revealing something that should not be revealed.
As I said, I do remember the storm of controversy, and there were articles coming out, and this and that, and yet here we are today, and it seems as if the Jewish community is now much more open to this discussion.
Well, they're open to it because, of course, I've been established in the Jewish community. My credentials of fighting for Jewish causes and for justice in Holocaust matters is now well established. Back when I wrote this book originally, the American Zionist, or the Zionist Organization of America, canceled the publication of their magazine, The American Zionist, on press because they had a cover story about this topic. Today, Mort Klein of the Americans of the ZOA has read the book and endorsed it as sensitive.
So, do you want to share with us then what took you into this line of research? This was your first book, right?
This was my first book, and prior to that, I had been a local investigative reporter. I had done some international undercover investigations. I was involved in an undercover operation on the last slave state in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and when I did that, my agent, an agent approached me from William Morris and said, "We want you to write a book for us. What are the top 5 books you'd like to write?" And I said, "Well, the one book," I gave him all sorts of ideas. I said, "The one book that is too hot to handle is the transfer agreement." What really motivated me to be involved in this was the Skokie March.
Tell us about that. Yeah.
Well, I think I was fundamentally naive. I was in such a cloistered, typical Jewish neighborhood environment that I couldn't understand how Jews could operate against their perceived self-interest. And during the Skokie March, I interviewed the Jewish attorney for the Nazis. I said, how can you do this? And at that time, I was schooled by Professor Byron Sherwin of Spertus College, who said there are many things we can't understand. And he told me there was something called the transfer agreement. I didn't believe it. And finally, I assembled a team of 20 or 30 historians and Holocaust survivors and children of Holocaust survivors. There was no second-generation movement. We went into 5 or 6 countries, accumulated all of the information. Some of it was not even in the archive. It was under people's desks. It was being protected. I went into the Jewish Agency. I went into the Leo Baeck Institute. And I found the information, I assembled it, and I produced a book.
So you're taking us to the process of putting it together. It's important to stop for a moment because the elaborate way in which the scheme was structured, and then to try and uncover it, and just what you've referred to right now, at a time pre-internet access to that kind of information must have been quite extraordinary. So maybe you could shed for our listeners a little something about the nature of the research that went into it and putting together a team to pull all this information together.
There was no internet. There were no computers. The manuscript was typed. And every time I changed a footnote, they had to retype the entire manuscript. It was retyped 30 times.
Wow.
By the way, on an IBM Selectric. So I was using the best IBM equipment even back then. I did this in the late 70s and the early 80s. We've had to assemble everything by hand. We did everything by carbon paper and by photocopy. There were very few Xerox places in Israel. It was hard to make a copy. But we assembled a team, and we had all these meetings, and we found the information. Most people didn't know what we were looking for. And at one point, I ran into an archivist in Israel who seemed to know where all the files were hidden. And I said to him, "How is it that you know so much about this?" He says, I was in the transfer agreement.
Wow.
And the word transfer in Hebrew is havara, which means transfer. Transfer Limited, Havara Limited, was the name of the overall company. And you must remember, this was encouraged by the Nazis, cooperated with by the Nazis, and the Nazis and the Zionists actually worked together because they had an intersecting interest. The Nazis wanted the Jews out of Germany. The Zionists wanted them into Palestine. The Nazis wanted to seize German assets, German Jewish assets. The Zionists wanted to save German Jewish assets, and the only way they could do it was by this transfer agreement.
So the Nazis were willing to work with Jews on this? Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
But their desire was to ultimately to exterminate the Jewish people. So was this before they had gone down that path, or it was serving their greater interest? Explain that to us a little bit.
Understanding the Nazi period for real is understanding a complex set of situations. It was actually Byron Sherwin from Spertus College who schooled me on the new approach to understanding both the reality and the perception of reality. And the perception of reality often dictates the real set of facts that occur on the ground and tumbling down the road. The Nazis saw working with the Zionists as the best, most expedient way to stop the boycott and to get the Jews out of Germany. Where were they going to go? They were going to go to Palestine. Now, there's another train of thought here. The Nazis believed in something called Völkisch thought. That means ethnic primacy.
Okay.
And they believed that the Germans had the Völkisch primacy in Europe, and they thought that the Jews needed to go to Palestine, quote, where they belonged. And so you had the fantastical idea of Goebbels and others publicly endorsing Jewish emigration to Palestine. The Nazis actually struck a coin with a Jewish star on one side and a swastika on the other. While all the Jewish organizations were shut down, the Zionists were allowed to maintain their operation and were allowed to grow. But you must understand, when the Zionists published their newspaper, they had Nazi censors in the office,
Sure.
overlooking every line. People don't understand exactly what the nature of the invasive Nazi regime was. It is easy to say they could have fought back, and on many levels people did fight back. But what the Zionists did is they were the realists, the cold, hard realists.
So let's talk about within the context of the Jewish community then, and the response, because you're bringing up some important issues here. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Were Jews passive? Were they resistant? You alluded a little while ago to the nature of an anti-Nazi boycott. So if you could just share with us a little bit about the backlash and what the Jewish community was trying to do in response to the early rise to Hitler's early rise to power.
Okay, we need to look at this as two titanic forces. The boycott to cripple the Reich and the transfer effort to save the Jews.
They seem to be on competing, parallel competing tracks here, yes?
No, they are on a collision course.
That's what I meant, collision course. Okay.
They're on a collision course because they cannot coexist.
Right.
The boycott movement did what had to be done. The Jews condemned the Nazis. They had million-man marches. There was a boycott in every city. It was led by the American Jewish Congress, by Stephen Wise, a famous name in Jewish history. There were rogue boycotts, organized boycotts.
And these were saying to all Americans as well as Jews,
No,
especially.
it wasn't just Americans. It was in Czechoslovakia. It was in England. It was in France.
Saying don't buy goods coming out of
Don't buy German goods and services.
Was there opposition to that, by the way, boycott, or was there?
Yes, there was opposition within the American Jewish community. It's very easy for people who look at the American Jewish community today and falsely believe it's monolithic. But you and I both know that the Jewish community back in the 30s was anything but monolithic.
Sure.
It's a very complex story, but the Jewish community was comprised, the Jewish leadership in this country was mainly run by what were known as German Jews, Hofjuden, which is the courtly Jews.
They didn't want to rock the boat so much.
Not only did they not rock the boat, they had led all the vigorous boycotts and protests against the Tsar, against France, against Damascus. They were the ones who fought back whenever Jews were persecuted. And whether or not the regime in question, the Tsar, would take retaliation or revenge upon the inhabitants was never an issue. They always had to stand up for Jewish rights.
Okay.
And they successfully defended Jewish rights all over the planet. In this case, the Jews who would be retaliated against were not some Russian guy called Sasha. This would now be their uncle Heinrich, their cousin, their daughter. It would hit home.
So they were afraid there would be a backlash against Jews in Germany, and some were counseling, wait a minute, we should back off on this.
Yes, and who am I talking about? Let's get names. American Jewish Committee. They were anti-Zionist.
In those days.
In those days, not now, of course. And B'nai B'rith, anti-Zionist, and also German Jewish in its major composition. And these guys wanted to work quietly, behind the scenes, petitioning government officials. They wanted nothing to do with any vigorous protest against Nazi Germany. Contrast that with the other Jewish organization, not the committees and the elite, but the democratic Jewish people. And that was the Eastern Jews, the so-called American Jewish Congress. It's really like labor and management.
Sure.
It was really the population against the elite, and the population said, we're going to protest this. We're going to not. And what did they have to protest? What was the weapon that the average Jew had to fight Hitler? The money in their pocket. That was it.
And not to use it for Nazi goods in Germany.
And not to use it for Nazi goods. Now, at the same time, when are we talking about? The height of the Depression. So, if you're going to boycott German pharmaceuticals and China and film and other goods and services for Czechoslovakian, French, American, lots of people are going to join that. Labor unions, the Czechoslovakians, Catholics who were outraged by what was being done in Germany, Protestants. This was interracial, this was non-sectarian. True, it was led by the Jews, but they were very careful to be all-inclusive and never call this a Jewish boy, a Jewish boycott.
Let's also keep in mind, there's also the nativist movement in America in the 1930s.
That's right.
The Jewish community was nowhere near as well organized or as willing to take positions as they are today, advocating on behalf of their fellow Jews, in part because of everything you've mentioned here. In some way, did this boycott feed into German Nazi notions about Jewish power?
That was the power of the boycott. You never measure a boycott in nickels and dimes or pfennigs and marks. You measure a boycott in ergs of fear.
Okay.
How afraid are you of the boycott?
And were they? Were the Germans?
The Nazis believed in Jewish boycotts. The Nazis believed in an international Jewish conspiracy which controlled money and markets. Adolf Hitler personally lionized his hero. Who was his hero? Henry Ford. And what brought Henry Ford down? A Jewish boycott run by the American Jewish Committee and B'nai B'rith and the Congress against the Ford Motor Company, and this was vividly in the minds of the Nazis. So the Nazis believed in the boycott almost as much as the boycotters believed in the boycott. If anyone comes to you with statistics, they don't know what they're talking about, because it's fear, it's economic fear that ruled the economy and the relations.
So how does this transfer agreement play into that backdrop of the boycott?
Without the boycott, the Nazis would have seen no necessity to work with the transfer agreement. So in that way, the boycott succeeded.
To kind of like succumb and go around it, so to speak.
That's right. By subverting the boycott, they could do the transfer agreement. The transfer agreement succeeded because it did bring the Jews out of Germany into Palestine, created a Jewish state, and had that not occurred, no one has a doubt what would have been the fate of those Jews.
Were there other areas of cooperation, by the way, between the Nazis and Palestine at that time?
Yes, there were. There were undercurrents.
Economic cooperation.
Yes, none of this is simple. This was complex, and that's why I spent 5 years putting it all together. Jewish Palestine was half agrarian, if not mostly agrarian, at that time in 1930s. The Jews did not own much of the land, which they did buy with transfer agreement money. They did not have a big infrastructure, but they had farms. And what was the biggest product?
I'm going to guess oranges, was it?
Oranges was the big product of Jewish Palestine. It was the economic wherewithal. Who was the #1 customer for oranges from Jewish Palestine? Nazi Germany. So now Jewish Palestine, which was, of course, abruptly surprised on January 30th with the takeover by Adolf Hitler, Jewish Palestine is now looking at their #1 customer,
Going Nazi, right?
which is the Third Reich, and if those oranges are not purchased, there can be no economic vitality for for Jewish Palestine, and there was the constant threat by the Third Reich: we won't buy Jewish oranges from Palestine, we'll buy fascist oranges from Spain. Valencias. So this is one of the important undercurrents. It's easy to see this in black and white. My challenge, and the challenge of history, is to see the complex grays that establish this very murky picture.
Well, let's go to some of those complex things, because obviously, just even in terms of what you touched upon so far, this was not a simple kind of a thing. It sounds like there's a lot of moving and shifting and maneuvering going on in terms of international merchandise purchase and sales. So can you share with us then, what were the dynamics of the transfer agreement? What was the essence of it?
Okay, it starts out with a Jew in Germany taking his money and putting it into a blocked account. Now, Reichmarks were hard to identify. They had dozens of different types of Reichmarks and Reichmark values. But generally speaking, across all of these fictitious and real mark systems, it was about 5,000 Reichmarks would equal the amount due. The Jew would put his money into a blocked account, a Sperrkonto, and that account would be fundamentally a trustee account. And that would be run by this bank in Germany. Then they would sell goods. They would sell pipes. They would sell taxis. They would sell it in Palestine. They would sell it in Lebanon. They would sell it in Turkey. They had all different types of commercial distribution for German goods. When the money was made available, the money was deposited in a second bank. The name of that bank was the Anglo-Palestine Bank. Okay. The Anglo-Palestine Bank renamed itself after the State of Israel was established, and the name is now Bank Leumi. Same bank. Anglo-Palestine Bank would take that money, credit through an international clearinghouse, the German trust fund. The German trust fund would issue the foreign currency of 1,000 British pounds. A capitalist certificate would be given to the German Jew, and that German Jew would then come across, and in many times he came across with replicas of his own home. He came across with carpets. He came across with building materials. He came across with cars. He came across with musical instruments. And suddenly there was a massive German Jewish and infrastructural and economic infusion into Jewish Palestine.
So let me ask you.
It's complex.
Okay, leaving aside the complexity, let me just ask a simple question then. Was this then a situation whereby the Jewish community and somehow was contributing to the Nazi efforts and helping to finance what it is that they wanted to be able to do?
Yeah.
And that must have been also one of the causes for such an explosive reaction to your book, right?
Yeah. It's a deal with the devil, not with the angels. It's a deal with the people who want to kill you. So basically, every time they rescued a Jew, they paid into the Nazi economy. And it's worse than that. I mean, there were many dynamics that I never even wrote about, but the Jews were compelled. The Jews were compelled to rescue Jews in this fashion.
It was a terrible choice to have to make.
It was a terrible choice that was thrust upon the Jews, but you do not, upon the Zionists, but you do not blame the hostage with the gun at their forehead.
Did the Zionists consult with anybody on this, or they just said, you know what, we've got to do this, and this is what we need to do? In other words, did they talk with the American Jewish Committee or Congress? I mean, I assume I know the answer. They just, went on their own. Is that right?
They didn't care about the American Jewish Committee.
Right.
In fact, Zionism was controlled out of London until this time. And by the time the transfer agreement came to the fore, the access point for Zionist authority had transferred to Jerusalem. And so the people on the ground in Jerusalem were making decisions. And they weren't just taking anyone on a first-come, first-served basis. They were actually concomitantly building the state of Israel. And so consequently, they took the people who had a chance of surviving in Jewish Palestine, not just anyone.
When we've used this term, the Zionists, that's the Zionist leaders, the Jewish nationalists. Any particular leaders that we know of who were involved in advocating for this?
Yes, the entire Jewish agency.
We're talking David Ben-Gurion.
We are talking about another gray, not black and white fabric. Just as I said, the American Jewish community was divided between these two different blocks.
In the Zionist community also there were...
The Zionist community was also not monolithic. There was what was called at that time the Labor Party, the Mapai Party.
Sure.
You're talking about people like Ben-Gurion. You're talking about a guy by the name of Chaim Arlazarov.
Sure.
Everybody who's been to Israel has been down the street called Arlazarov.
Absolutely right.
And Arlazarov was the chief engineer of this agreement, and he was murdered for it on the beach in Tel Aviv at the location where the Hilton now stands in Tel Aviv.
Sure.
Right there. There was no Hilton there at that time, and he was killed presumably by the followers of the dissident Zionist faction, and that dissident Zionist faction was led by a group associated with Menachem Begin, but really associated with Jabotinsky.
The revisionists.
And they called themselves revisionists. And the term revisionist at that time meant we have a new idea for Zionism. And these were the fighting Zionists. These were the Zionists who said, we want to fight Hitler. We don't want to have a deal with him. And consequently, as the Jewish community was torn apart on the subsuming and subverting the boycott, the Zionist community was fighting. They had riots. They had contentious votes. They were tearing their hearts out, saying, "How can we cut a deal with these Nazis?" Because Right now, it's common to say the Nazis weren't thinking of extermination. I've gone into the record. My first use of the word, my first common use of the word extermination in Nazi literature goes back to 1933. And that's because that was the word they used in World War I to exterminate the Armenians, was extermination. So consequently, it was a word of parlance of the day, and the Zionists completely expected everything that happened because they had a complete grasp on Jewish history, on the worthlessness of Jewish life at the hands of murderers. They had seen many, many Jews die in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world.
So I want to fast forward now. We're talking about the controversy that occurred then. We're talking about the controversy about the book. On a personal level, exposing this, dealing with this, writing about this, obviously must have been a lot of, well, I don't know what to say, whether it was ad hominems, attacks, or whatever. What was it like when the book first came out for you in that context?
Well, this was my first book. I was only, you know, I was in my 20s when I started it. It came out in 1984. I had been the editor of a city magazine, but I'd never been exposed on the international stage. The book was published worldwide, and people were shocked, surprised, confused. There was a town hall meeting set up in Chicago to discuss this, and it was supposed to be in some little JCC social room, and by 1 o'clock so many people had made reservation. They moved it to a large synagogue, and then they moved it to a football stadium. And I had 1,100 people waiting to hear me talk about this, and it was rough. There were people who, they said that Muammar Gaddafi was financing me. I had picket lines. They said my parents were from Kuwait. Of course, they're Polish survivors. They hired psychologists to psychoanalyze me. Why am I doing this book? But ultimately, the test of time, the historical veracity, the truth of the book.
Were you surprised, or did you anticipate that it may have that kind of reaction, by the way?
I anticipated because that was my reaction.
Okay.
I hated the project.
But you like the book?
Well, I wrote the book.
Rewrite the book.
The book had to be written, and I wrote it.
So it was a story you felt had to be told?
Yeah, I was on a quest.
So
it was trial by fire for my first book. It prepared me well for IBM and the Holocaust.
So were you surprised as you were doing your research with where you got, in other words, or when you started it, did you think it would reveal what you ultimately learned about the whole setup?
The entire book covers the minute-by-minute developments in 3 countries, accounting for time zone shifts in Jewish Palestine, Germany, and the United States. We have diplomatic messages going back and forth, and it only covers the first 8 months of 1933. It's very, very intense. It accomplished what I wanted to do, which is to understand what had happened, and
so you went into it wanting to understand, but my question is, were you surprised by the conclusion, or you kind of, as you started to get into it, see where it was
I never
taking you?
wanted to find the conclusion that I had.
Okay.
It was pretty wide, and it's kind of like that with a lot of my books. I never believe how far it's going to go, and I take it to the end of the factual line.
I remember you're telling me about the IBM book and saying you just stood at the Holocaust Museum staring at the IBM machine there and wondering, the computer, why is that there? So I know that you just process it and think about it. What were, tell us about what would be, when it first had come out, the worst moment, your most gratifying moment as well, just to...
Well, the worst moment, what was the worst moment? The worst moment was probably when I had a guy, that there were people attending my one of my lectures. He was an undertaker, and he said to my parents, "We want to bury your son's book."
Wow.
And the best moment was when I won the Carl Sandburg Award from the best book of the year, and I became a cause celeb in the Jewish media, and from there I developed a syndicated column in 50 Jewish newspapers, all on the strength of the transfer agreement. The Jewish media actually, well, I didn't even know there was a Jewish media. I didn't know there were, at that time, Jewish newspapers in every city, and the Jewish newspapers plastered this all over and gave it a great deal of credence, and it gave me entree to pursue my wider mission of exposing injustice against the Jews, Holocaust factuality and verity, and to do the other things that I've done.
So it really launched your career. You went on, you became a columnist in Jewish newspapers, as well as, I believe, for the Jerusalem Post and elsewhere.
Yes, I was syndicated throughout the world. In fact, Louis Farrakhan granted me the first interview, the first interview for a Jewish journalist, because he had read the transfer agreement.
Interesting.
And based on that book, he actually made a statement, often quoted, the Jews have a gut of religion, the Jews made a deal with the Nazis, and I know...
This is what he's referring to?
Yeah, and I know because a Jewish author wrote it. And so there are a lot of antagonists who use this information to invalidate the Jewish state, and who use this information falsely to claim that the Holocaust did not exist. It's just, but these same people will use the Bible, the biography of Golda Meir, the autobiography of Ben Gurion, Moshe Dayan. They will use anything that they have, and they are frustrated by the fact that I have brought out the truth, which is that the Zionists rescued Jews. Now, there were transfer agreements in other countries. There was the potentiality of rescuing millions of Jews. Millions of Jews could have been rescued. You have to ask yourself whether or not the Nazis would have been stopped by people running up and down the street with placards, or whether it took something more. The Zionists were the only realists of the time. And by the way, there was no country. There was no major corporation. There was no major organization that did not have vibrant relations, commercial and diplomatic, with the Nazis at that time.
So let me ask you a question. Your website lists the many different books you've written on, topics you've talked about, whether it's oil addiction, whether it's the Holocaust, whether, other topics. If I'm not mistaken, this is not one that you usually talk about.
Right. I do about 300 events a year. I talk about IBM and the Holocaust. I talk about oil addiction, Nazi Nexus, all of these books. I don't talk about the transfer agreement.
It almost seems to me, if I can say this, I don't want to be psychoanalyzing, you said before, almost like you have a love-hate relationship with it.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I always tell people, read this book last. I've got eight, 9 books. In fact, I told a reviewer from the Miami Herald, if you review this book, you're going to hate it. It's not a comfortable book to read.
Well,
it was a less comfortable book to write. But the Holocaust is not comfortable, and the truth is never comfortable.
Now, in the back of the book, as well as in the when you signed it, and you did this for me as well, you wrote, you asked the question, was it madness or was it genius?
Yeah.
You want to shed any light on that? Do you want to?
Well, all genius is based on madness. So it was both.
Well, it's a brilliant work and an important one. What I want to do now is I want to turn things over to Mitchell Bard, who is going to share with us some questions that some other scholars have submitted, and we'll take it from there.
Well, it's hard to know where to start with this subject, but Martin Gilbert, who, as you know, is Winston Churchill's biographer, and he's the author of a number of books on the Holocaust and author of a forthcoming book on Muslim rules, a 1,400-year history. He wrote, "What do you think would have been the impact on the Israeli ability to absorb Holocaust survivors in the 1940s had the transfer agreement not occurred in the 1930s?"
The main value of the transfer agreement is 1.9, 1.4 to 1.7 to 1.9 billion dollars, equivalent dollars in today's money that was transferred over, was not trinkets. It was fundamentally infrastructure. When Jews came over during the Hitler period and en masse, and after the fall of the Third Reich, they came over in huge waves. Where were they going to live? What water were they going to use? Where were the roads going to be? Where were the lands? Had the transfer agreement never occurred in the 1930s, there would not have been the infrastructure to rapidly absorb all of these Jews. Let's remember this. The Nazi program was continued, as you well know, after World War II by the Arabs. They expelled approximately 1 million Jews from Arab lands in the years after the fall of the Third Reich. These people were not put into refugee camps. They were quickly absorbed. The name of the immigration ministry in Israel is called the Ministry of Absorption, and they absorbed these people. And so the answer to Martin Gilbert is that had Israel, the state of Israel, not been aided with this important impetus during the Depression years, it would have been, I think, difficult to absorb hundreds of thousands of Jews who came en masse during the years to follow. And this was, in fact, anticipated.
I have another question from Professor Samuel Edelman in Chico, California, who's the executive director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. He asks, there were other transfer agreements across Europe, such as one in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary. Why didn't those succeed in transferring more Jews to Palestine?
Well, this is true. There was a transfer agreement in Italy. There was a transfer agreement in Czechoslovakia, in Romania. They each had their own financing schemes. And as the situation became more dire for the Jews in Europe, remember Hitler went into Czechoslovakia and he went into Austria and he began to take over Europe. The Zionists rushed frantically to set up more transfer agreements to save the Jews, because you must remember this very important statement, and I will quote you a phrase you know well, that Chaim Weizmann said, the world is divided into two places. Those places where Jews cannot live and those places where Jews cannot go. Most people think that Evian is just water you buy at the store. The Evian Conference lives with us in 1938 as what to do with hundreds of thousands of refugees, where the doors were shut. So Palestine was the only door open to the Jews. They weren't allowed into most of the nations of the world. So these transfer agreements had the possibility to transfer hundreds of thousands of more Jews. Romania, Hungary, most of the Hungarian Jews were wiped out in transports. They were organized in Hungary by one of the members of the board of directors of IBM, Edmund Wiesenmeyer. And imagine if these Jews had come by the boatload, literally, into Jewish Palestine. What happened? The war happened. Economics stopped. International trade became illegal. And the Zionists were not able to continue transferring these monies out in an effective and meaningful fashion. And so the war caught up with the transfer agreement before the transfer agreement could catch up with the genocide.
Professor Byron Sherwin of Spertus College, the author of many books on ethics, and most recently The Life Worth Living, who was also, you mentioned the scholar who first told you about the transfer agreement, asks, You first heard about the agreement in an interview you did with me in the 1970s. I recall that when I told you about it in very general terms, you found it hard to believe that it actually happened. Now, after all your research, writing, and thinking about it, do you still find it hard to believe that it happened?
I didn't believe it happened in those days because I wasn't smart enough to know that it happened. I wasn't wise enough to know. I'd barely been out of Chicago. The march in question was one in Skokie, where my parents lived. It was just outside. If I was presented with this information now, I would believe it in an instant. I would have never believed that IBM would have had a 12-year pact, a widespread commercial coalition with the Third Reich to identify the Jews and even to create the basis of the Auschwitz tattoo. I would have never believed that the Rockefeller Foundation would have financed a program that sent Mengele into Auschwitz. I believe all of these things now, and I believe them because of the trial by fire that I had when I did the transfer agreement.
Professor Sherwin offers a second and very penetrating question. If the revisionist Zionists led by Vladimir Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin had been controlling the Jewish agency instead of Chaim Sorov, would there have been a transfer agreement? Would there have been German reparations to the State of Israel in the 1950s? And what might have been the economic and political outcomes for the State of Israel in its very early history?
Well, I'm constantly asked what-if questions on the transfer agreement. What if the boycott had succeeded? What if the transfer agreement had never been there? But here's one I think I can answer. And it's very dangerous. If is the sketchiest word in history. What if? I believe if the revisionists had controlled the transfer agreement, the Jewish agency at the time, I doubt very strongly that there would have been a transfer agreement with the Nazis. Now, it's important for me to explain here the delicate fabrics of the revisionist movement. They had actually good relations with the fascist Italian regime because they believed in a very strict organization. They believed in that, but I do not believe, based upon the immense vituperative reaction of the revisionists, that they would have ever allowed the Zionist organization and movement to cut a deal with the Nazis. They would have rather fought them, and they did fight them. And by the way, from that you can extrapolate on your own what the economic consequences would be. Now, would there have been reparations to Israel? Those reparations were actually calculated in 1938 by Nachum Goldman. I had access to his unprocessed papers at the American Jewish Archives in 1938. In 1938, before the war broke out, years before Auschwitz was established, the Zionists were already anticipating the worst. Why? Because they were realists. Because when Hitler said we're going to destroy the Jews, they actually paid attention. And they actually went out and did mathematical calculations on Nachum Goldman. I have the report. I've never mentioned it until this moment, on what the anticipated destruction, economic and human, would be if Hitler succeeded. And Hitler almost succeeded. He succeeded 99% in many countries, and he was stopped, but just barely.
You mentioned 1938. That was also the year of Kristallnacht. We're coming up on the 71st anniversary in another week or so.
And you wrote a distinguished book on Kristallnacht.
Right. And one of the things I found in my book, 48 Hours on Kristallnacht, was that even after seeing what went on, the U.S. government wasn't willing to actively rescue Jews. What did you find in your book and your research about the U.S. government's position back in 1933 and at the time of this agreement?
Well, I think that the doors began closing for the Jews very quickly after the first months of 1933. There were refugees everywhere. We're talking about South Africa. We're talking about Australia. It was very common for Jews in Germany to escape to Austria, And in 1938, they went from Austria to Czechoslovakia, and then the Germans followed them there. And from Czechoslovakia, they went to France, and then the Germans took over France, and in a bifurcated fashion. And so it was the Jews. When Chaim Weizmann said, "The world is divided into places where Jews are not allowed to be, and not allowed to go," it was the reality, and this was the dire challenge of the Zionists. There's an important dichotomy here. Are we going to make an effort to restore Jewish civil rights, or to rescue Jews for national rights? Either you're going to take $1 to keep a Jew where he is and help him get through the starvation imposed upon him. We're going to take $1 and transfer him. This is real politics. Remember, even the relief packages that were given to German Jews to get through starvation, those also went into the German economy. This is too complex to be black and white, and too complex for, it was almost too complex for me. That's why it took about 5 years to figure out.
Walid Ferris in Washington, D.C., who is an expert on Middle East affairs and the author of The Confrontation, Winning the War Against Future Jihad, asks, what do you think would have been the impact or lack of it on the Israeli economy and modern Israel if there had never been a transfer agreement?
There are many institutions today, such as Mekarot, the water company, which are taken for granted. These are infrastructural companies, and these companies occurred due to the investment that came over the transfer of assets. Now, it's common for some people to say, well, the transfer agreement did not rescue people, it rescued money. That's not true. It rescued people. It's true that the rescue of the individuals was metered out in cadence with the purchase and distribution of Nazi goods. But the fact of the matter is, they had to buy these goods in order to rescue the people. Now, what's interesting is, when the Jews were in concentration camps, they didn't say, "I'm German." They didn't say, "I'm Polish." They said, "I'm a Zionist. I wish to live." And the Zionists endorsed that. Jews have a right to live, and they saved the remnant, and they saved the remnant with the gun to the head. And that gun has never been removed from the temple, even though it's gone an inch or two away. The gun is still always cocked, and if I could just put an asterisk in for modern times, we still have today the Iranians trying to do in 12 minutes what Hitler could not do in 12 years, which is wipe out the Jews. And so the Zionists understood that there needs to be a strong Jewish state so that Jews have the same national aspirations other groups do.
Martin Cohen, a student in Jerusalem, asks, why did so many other historians fail to write about the transfer agreement and the anti-Nazi boycott?
They didn't want to. The transfer agreement was understood. There were several treatises in German and in Hebrew academic circles. It's not like today, where somebody does a master's thesis and puts it up on the internet, and suddenly 1 million people have access to it. When I went to the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, and I looked at the user guide, the finder's aid, and I said, where are the, I said, the files are supposed to be in this folder. Where are they? They're not in this file. They're not in this cabinet. Where are they? He said, they're underneath my desk. And he gave them to me. The book tried to do what many historians does not seek to do, which is to be all-encompassing on a narrow topic, instead of doing a very slender matter. And so I had to work not in 1 or 2 archives, but in 20 or 30. And I had to put all of this together. And this was how this was the invention of the Edwin Black approach to Holocaust documentation. Never to look at one place, but 20 places, and to put it all together in a giant puzzle. But the short answer is why they didn't want to, why they didn't do it. They didn't want to.
Well, James Matthews.
And by the way,
yes.
I didn't want to.
I could see why, given the uncomfort of the whole subject. James Matthews in Sydney is a reader who wrote, could the worldwide anti-Nazi boycott have toppled the Hitler regime if not undermined by the Zionists, or if it was endorsed by the Zionists?
It's another one of these what-if questions that is impossible to answer and inappropriate to answer, but I'll try. The boycott would not have been was not capable of toppling the German regime. Because remember, we're talking about a regime, people who quote statistics on the German economy don't know what they're talking about. This was an illegal, corrupt economy that stole other people's money as their own economic wherewithal. When they stopped stealing it from their citizens, they stole it from neighboring countries. It was a fascist economy. So it would only make the Hitler regime more desperate. But what the boycott could have done is possibly, in its early stage, had an impact on some of the policies. And we see it did have an impact, because without the boycott, there would be no transfer agreement. The only reason the Nazis felt compelled to negotiate with their enemies, the Jewish nationalists, was because this boycott was a weapon that the Nazis, in their mythical confusion, actually feared.
On the subject of the boycott, Joyce Nelson in New York, another reader asks, was the anti-Nazi boycott just a boycott of Jews, or was it bigger than that?
It was way bigger than that. It was never called a Jewish boycott. There were Catholics involved. Some of the greatest figures in the New York Archdiocese and Boston Archdiocese were involved. The Polish were involved. Labor unions were involved. The Protestant community was involved. The organizers of the boycott against the Nazis were very careful to sculpt this as not just a Jewish tragedy, but one which was threatening the world. You know what they say? The Jews first and everybody else second. And that's why they did it the way they did. It was extremely credible. But then when the Jewish organizations backed off the boycott because of the transfer agreement, it was left to a bunch of unsupported, random people who for years walked up and down the streets with protest signs and still carried the torch. And I'm glad that they did. Both were necessary. We needed to protest the Hitler regime, and we needed to save the Jews. I am not unhappy that both occurred.
Well, Kenneth Babu in Fresno, California, a computer programmer, actually asked a related question. Granted what you're saying about the importance of the boycott, he wonders, did the Zionists cooperate too soon and for too little?
People need to understand the minute Germany. If there was a Zionist who pushed too hard on his German negotiator, he could be killed. He could be sent to a concentration camp. There was a limit to how far the Zionists could play their own cards. And the best card that they had, the best card, was that people over there who we can't control, these American Jewish organizations, are protesting by the hundreds of thousands and bankrupting your companies, which were falling by the wayside, and we have the ability to circumvent that. So from the Nazis' point of view, they were dividing the Jewish community with the transfer agreement, as well as serving all these other interests that I've discovered. No, they didn't do too little too soon. They did as much as they could as soon as they could, but they did it in a different set of modalities.
A student in Berlin, Dennis Katz, asks, did the Zionists think that Jewish Palestine would be safe from the Nazis, or were they afraid that given Hitler's designs on the Middle East as well, that that would also be a dangerous place?
I think it was always understood by many that that Hitler thought of Palestine as a great big prison camp for the Jews. They'd be put there in Palestine, and then they could take over the Middle East. But I think the Zionists thought let's save the Jews on Monday and we'll figure out what happens on Friday. You know, it's always been a Jewish aspiration. We don't want to be killed before Shabbos.
Yeah.
Well, let's finish with a last question from Joseph Myers, a retired teacher here in Montreal. How did your work on the transfer agreement affect you personally, and why is this one event in Washington your only event on this book when you speak so often on your other books?
Well, it's an appropriate final question. It affected me personally in that it set me off on a circumnavigation of the world of evil. And as circumnavigating the world of evil and injustice against the Jews and other groups, the further I go, the more I end up at the same point. And I always end up where I started. So it's done that to me. As to why this is my only event, because I choose to.
Well, I want to thank Rabbi Weinblatt for a stimulating discussion, and Edwin for a very important book, which even 25 years later, as you say, still covers and offers a very powerful message for us. Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mitch.
Edwin Black is the author of many books, including IBM and the Holocaust, War Against the Weak, and Internal Combustion. He's the editor of The Cutting Edge News. For more information, visit transferagreement.com.
Sunday, Tufts University history professor Peniel Joseph on the 1964